So Dave, if you could please share your screen. And Dave is going to drill down now very specifically around the sort of the systems that we have here on the New South Wales coast and subtropical systems. Thanks, Dave. Over to you.
Yes, thanks, guys. Thanks, Rich. Let me just start my video. Yeah, so Rich went over the general concepts there. So I suppose what I'll talk a little bit about is you know, what else is driving our seasonal nitrogen demand, and present some findings from our research around the casino area and sort of into the more southern Queensland sort of regions, northern areas of the subtropical zone, but should still be relevant to the rest of the regions as well. So once again, we're talking about the right rate and the right time with our nitrogen here. So the right time, Rich covered quite well. I suppose what we're talking about is the right rate, and there's two things that are going on there. There's not just basically what are the ideal conditions for plant growth, but there's also what is the soil supplying in terms of mineralisation. And so that really also determines the right rate, because if your soils are pumping out a lot of nitrogen through microbial breakdown of the organic matter, then there's not a lot of point of adding additional nitrogen on top of that. So how do we basically go out and determine when those conditions are going to be ideal for that nitrogen mineralisation? So what we're looking at here from Casino is this is our fertiliser nitrogen demand. So this is actually how much nitrogen the plants are taking up over the year. And so, you know, as Rich mentioned, and we've seen this again and again, I mean, it's, you know, pretty common knowledge, I suppose, but our really high demand period is through that sort of spring, early spring, August, September, October sort of period. And that's where we're getting most of our bang for the buck out of our nitrogen fertiliser. As we come into summer, our soil temperatures increase, the microbes in the soil get a bit of a kick on. Assuming there's enough water there, they will basically start to break down the organic matter and they'll release the nitrogen. So you get a bit of a burst of spring and summer mineralisation. And that you see this in this graph here is actually our demand for nitrogen decreases because there's more nitrogen being generated from the organic matter. As you mentioned in our last webinar last month, sometimes we might have an east coast low come down. It actually, you know, flushes out a lot of that mineralisation and depletes our soil nitrogen pool. So we actually, you know, decrease the supply of nitrogen from mineralisation in the autumn. That frequently happens, and so we might need to top it back up again, just because the demand's back there again. This rye sowing period is a bit of a tricky one. I think it's actually covered in next month's seminar, but typically we see low plant demand there. So just because there's low plant demand there doesn't really mean we shouldn't be fertilising, but at least there's not a lot of demand for the fertiliser there. The plants are getting quite hammered, either through your establishment methods or through, because the plants are quite small for the ryegrass. And so we're not going to see a lot of plant uptake of nitrogen in that period of time. So the periods here is where we have high plant demand, or these sort of spring, when you have plenty of water, you know, soil temperatures are starting to pick up, and before the mineralisation really sort of kicks off in the summer. And so this is looking at mineralisation then. So really that depends on your soil type. As a basically rule of thumb, you're looking at around 2% of your total soil nitrogen is mineralised annually. And so if you have a soil test and you know what your soil nitrogen is, you can sort of get a very rough proxy for that. Most of that mineralisation, and you can see this top line here, occurs after these large rainfall events in summertime. So it's not necessarily matching with, you know, when you want your nitrogen there. And often it actually is released in excess and lost from the system, particularly when it's combined with large rain events. So it can be a useful sort of top up to the system, but otherwise it can also be a bit of a loss from the system, unfortunately. But usually during the winter time, it is constrained by low soil temperatures. It's also constrained by low moisture. So if you have low soil temperatures, you're unlikely to see a huge amount of mineralisation going on. It is constrained by low moisture as well, but it's not so constrained as plant growth. So you usually do get a accumulation of soil nitrogen from organic matter over dry periods, and that might give you a bit of a flush of growth if you have a long dry period and then a bit of rain. And that often can also lead to issues like nitrate poisoning if you have sort of grass that sort of grew a bit and ran out of moisture, but enough to accumulate the high nitrates in there. So it's something to watch out for, because we can actually accumulate quite a lot of nitrate under dry conditions. And so this is a soil, lateritic soil around Gympie itself, up in southern Queensland. We're looking at nitrogen supplied about 168 kilograms of nitrogen per annum. Sort of duplex soils down in the Camden area looking around 100 kilos, and the heavy black soils around the Casino region are looking at around 200 kilos. So it can be a substantial pool of nitrogen. So does that match up with plant demand? Not really. What we see here is this is our plant growth when we don't put any fertilizer on. This is with luxury fertilizer. So we can see the difference between these two growth rates and basically work out how much nitrogen we're removing from the system per day. So on average, we're looking around, without any fertilizer, just the baseline, you're looking at around 0.4 on average nitrogen per hectare per day being removed in the plant biomass. So that's what the soil's supplying. What our plant demand then is, once again, on average over the whole year, you're looking at 1.3 kilos of N per day. So obviously there's a big discrepancy there. So putting on fertilizer does make a difference. But as you can see from these right-hand graphs, the top one being daily dry matter production and the bottom one being daily nitrogen uptake, is that it's very heavily skewed towards that August-September period. In fact, we're up to around sort of 2.5, 2.6 kilos of nitrogen per day being taken up by the plants. So that's basically the plant demand at that stage. As we move into the summer, it gets a lot more variable, and this is sort of what Rich was saying around the soil moisture. And so it really depends if you've got the moisture there or not, and also the supply from mineralisation around those east coast lows, which are sort of somewhat unpredictable. But we're pretty safe that in this period we can probably top up our fertiliser application quite a lot, because we might be only putting on 1 kilo a day or 1.5 kilos a day, but actually the demand there is much higher, particularly in that spring period. And sort of the potential for losses in that period then are also quite low. So sort of putting it on in this late winter spring period is not a bad strategy. There's a lot of graphs here, but I'll go through them sort of one by one. So what we're looking at here is we ran some analysis on what would happen if we increased our fertiliser application rates under a dry season, an average season, and a wet season. And so this is what we see in ryegrass at Casino. The first one is seasonal dry matter yields. We're looking at nitrogen losses, fertiliser recovery, seasonal profit, and the marginal dry matter response. So in ryegrass, we see, well, we get a nice increase with increasing fertiliser rates in dry matter for all seasons, not too surprising. We don't see a huge difference between the wet and the dry seasons, and that's usually because we have lower ET during this period. This is an irrigated system, so we do have that supplementary irrigation if it's needed. And actually, in the wetter systems, it's actually a little bit lower than the average one because we probably have the higher losses there. But we're looking at, so this 200 kilos is about 1.6 kg per day. That's when we're sort of starting to plateau out with our nitrogen rates. But in good seasons or good growing seasons, that pretty much keeps on going up. Our losses don't really change a lot between the different seasonal responses, and neither does our profit. So this is what happens in the ryegrass. If we move to the kikuyu, you can see we get a very different response. So actually in our dry season, we're not getting a lot of rain there, so we're not really just not seeing that nitrogen response. So it's certainly not worth putting on that fertilizer, regardless if you're chasing kikuyu or not. In the wet season, however, because you have that adequate soil moisture, you do see that nice response. The flip side to that being your losses also substantially increase, but it's certainly still profitable to put that on, assuming that you need that kikuyu in your system. And then the tricky one, I suppose, is what do we do over this transition period? And as you can see, we've pretty much seen flat nitrogen responses here. The question is more, is any nitrogen better than no nitrogen, rather than should we putting on, increasing amounts of nitrogen? Because, in this period, if there hasn't been a large East Coast low coming through before, then there's probably still enough sort of residual nitrogen in the organic matter that gets released later in the season. We then hit the cold temperatures and there's low nitrogen demand anyway. So we don't see a lot of value of putting higher N rates on during this sort of April, May, June sort of period. But what we can see, when we have the wet conditions, our losses can actually increase, which obviously leads to a not very nice return for our profit. So this is basically seasonal results. So this is looking at an average over the season, and with this in mind, through this transition period, that's actually the average over the whole season. So you might still get 1 or 2 grazings later in the season where you do see a response, but over the whole season, it doesn't appear to be worthwhile. But actually, even within seasons, we have very different responses, and this is really just driven by a range of things, mainly soil moisture, but also grazing cycle, how well the ryegrass is established, and a whole suite of things. So really, it's really, if your plants aren't growing well, for whatever reason, whether you're on a tight grazing cycle or there was poor establishment, you're not going to see a lot of advantage of putting on huge amounts of nitrogen. Certainly, you can sort of start to increase it, but those high rates are really, not going to see much additional benefit. So it's really coming back to matching your nitrogen supply with plant demand. And so what we see here is these are actually 3 individual cuts. We have a flat rate, a seasonal average, and a pretty low rate. So the flat rate would have happened when there was plenty of nitrogen in the profile already. So for whatever reason, whether it was a nice warm condition and there was lots of mineralisation going on, even though it's in the ryegrass, on this particular cut, we saw very little nitrogen response. We saw very high production, but very little nitrogen response. Whereas this one, we probably had some other issue restricting our grazing. So I think actually in this case, they were grazing probably a bit too early. And so once again, those high nitrogen rates, not really, even though it's increasing and we still got increased profits and all that sort of stuff, the biomass growth was actually quite low. And you can see that reflected through the harvest return and basically the profit. So if you've got a flat nitrogen response, then you're not going to make any additional money and your profit's going to go down. Keep in mind that this is only one grazing cycle. Some of that nitrogen is still going to be reserved in the soil. And so it would be potentially picked up later in the season. But looking at just within the one cycle, it doesn't make much difference. Another example here. So we're looking in more this is actually, should say, irrigated kikuyu, not ryegrass. But we see once again a couple of different scenarios. One where we got really ideal conditions. One where we're not really seeing those changes too much, simply because probably water's limiting. For this one down here, we've got adequate soil moisture, and it's really utilising that additional nitrogen that's there. And once again, that sort of comes through into the profit, and you can see our sort of break-even point changes quite a lot, and our potentially profit point is, so certainly worth that if you need that additional feed. So I thought I'd just finish by a few general comments around what we should be keeping an eye on, or really around conversation points for this particular, when do we actually apply nitrogen, and how much benefit there is to sort of moving away from a flat rate. So getting an understanding on the underlying mineralisation rates is important. First of all, for your soil and basically the capacity of those soils. We see that the clay soils are a lot more dependent on mineralisation. So mineralisation plays a much more important factor there. They suck in the nitrogen during the ryegrass period, and they hold it, and they can actually release that much more over summer. On the sandier soils, this is less so. They're much more responsive, so they actually take up the nitrogen. The plants will take up the nitrogen much more when it's applied, and there'll be less carried over for the summer. So that's something to consider, that you know, in a clay soil, you'll actually see that benefit go through the summer much more than you will in a sandier soil. There's still some questions around, which we'll cover in the next seminar. How much we apply at sowing. There's a series of trade-offs that we need to be aware of there. Certainly, there's usually good moisture in autumn, and so there's some trade-offs there as well, I suppose. Soil moisture is one of the biggest drivers, both for mineralisation and just for plant growth. So, you know, if there's got moisture there, it's probably worth putting the nitrogen back on. In spring, we do get really good growth rates, assuming you got adequate soil moisture. The question is, what happens later in the season when you start to run out? I suppose as long as you're not moving into sort of late summer, it's not too bad. The risk being in late summer that you start to get these east coast lows coming down, and that's where your increased chances of losses are happening. In August, we've got our highest growth rates. I mean, we sort of recommend putting on more nitrogen, sort of what Rich was saying in this period, because this is when our pastures really have high demand for it. And so what other signals can we use as well to see if we sort of got some sort of idea that our nitrogen rates are right? You know, a simple one, if you've got low nitrogen, is of course looking at urine strains. What happens if you've got too high nitrogen? There's issues you're running into with nitrates, particularly in annual ryegrass. But there's very little sort of visual indication that you've got running at too high nitrogen, and that's a bit of a problem. Like, how do we actually know when we need to put the brakes on? That's a big question. So I think we'll end there and hand it over to the Q&A.